Hello, I'm Siguna. I've been a professional mathematician most of my life. Grew up in Austria, came to Laramie, Wyoming in 2005 as an assistant professor at the university. A few years ago, I decided to change career to science. And last year I graduated with my second PhD in biomedical sciences, and I want to talk a little bit about some of my own research. The topic concerns what I call the code behind the genetic code. Throughout history, people have always been fascinated by the question, how can something come out of quote-unquote nothing? And in terms of biology, I think we have the right formulation in that we say at conception, new life is formed. If you look down onto the molecular level, what's going on inside that is responsible for all of this is the genome of the individual organisms. So here is the DNA, which is for most organisms how the information is stored inside of the genes. At the end, what you see here on the right is where the information is encoded and becomes matter, protein. This is a very complex process, and there is no way I can talk about this in detail. At the core of this process, it is what is known as the genetic code. The way it works is that the code reads out information from within the DNA and groups this information as words of 3 consecutive characters and then turns those into respective proteins. Please keep this in mind because I want to come back to this later. So the problem I was told by my advisor for my dissertation was to use tools from mathematics and information theory to find differentiating and distinguishing features inside of the genetic code between different organisms. And hey, it would make sense that different organisms would shape and optimize their genome in a different way. And in fact, it had long been conjectured that the genetic code is optimized. Problem has only been, how do you evaluate this? What would be the features to measure in which way it is optimized? And there has been a lot of conflicting results stated along these lines. Okay, let's shift gears here a little bit. If I asked you, how would you store or describe the information here on the screen? Now you would say that's very simple. This can all be compressed. It's all at once. Right? It's very simple. Another way of looking at this is trying to predict the next character or the next symbol from the previous one. This is a topic of information theory. And in fact, information theory tells us very clever methods how and that information can be stored in an optimal way. The code that is doing this is known as the Huffman code. It turns information in such a way and represents it in a way that the output is optimal in terms of average length or average cost. And I cannot go into detail here what I mean by average cost. Now, what is interesting here is why does the Huffman code only consider average information? Well, think about it. If you were to take it into the context of languages, you would want to say more than just the symbol 1 or A. And this is really what's at the heart of the genetic code. It uses the different characters and their respective frequency distributions to map it in a way that at the end of the day, the resulting representation is as efficient as possible. Okay, and that brings me back to the genetic code. Because I asked myself, there is also so-called text characters inside the genome. Those would be those chemical groups inside of the DNA. They also show up with a certain frequency. I've just copied out part of the genome. And you can see that there are specific so-called base pairs, those characters. I was wondering, is there something behind the genetic code that utilizes these base pair frequencies so that the code gets read out as in terms of blocks or words of length 3? Or in other words, is there something behind the genetic code? Is the genetic code already a code or an encoding of something else? So what I did, I took the human genome and blocked it inside the Huffman code. I was using the frequencies from inside the human genome. Not exactly, I had to tweak it just a little bit, but let's leave this aside. This is just a technical issue. What I came up with is this huge tree here, which is the output of the Huffman code. Now you probably can't read it, but the way you read it out, you start at the root and you have 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. This gives an alternative way to represent the genetic code. This is exactly how the genetic code can be represented as Huffman code. Now what does this mean? It means that information inside of the genome is represented in its optimal way. Now that is fascinating. What I had not expected was the following. This result is true for all the genomes of all the different organisms that I considered. And I looked at quite a few of them. So in other words, every genome is the manifestation of this same type of optimal encoding. What it is, it's pure divine intelligence. That isn't something abstract, but that's maintained on the molecular level. What this reminded me of is just like rays of sunlight, or just a realization of sun here on Earth. The same way divine intelligence is realized in each cell of all living beings. And it's pointing back to the same divine source of love, of beauty, of brilliance, whatever you might call it. So I personally grew up in a Christian home. And personally, one of my greatest challenges or goals has been trying to figure out and understand God. And as a scientist, I've very much been relying on my rational mind. And it has, for many years, been a little bit frustrating. When I realized my own result, it suddenly brought another dimension to one of the sayings of Jesus Christ in the New Testament. When he said, "Consider the birds of the air and the flowers of the field." I think he said it because he knew about the divine love and intelligence that is encoded in all living beings. Just as the rays of the sun give us warmth, but draw us back, bring our attention back to where it's coming from, the sun itself. I think the same way Jesus is giving us an invitation to, when we're out in nature or when we're alone somewhere in silence, that we can just be still and acknowledge God and be in awe of him. And I think that's beautiful. That's really what I wanted to say.